Welcome, everyone, to the Next Best Picture podcast, where we are talking with James Marsh, the director of the new film Dance First. James, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Indeed, well, I'll let you know how it goes when we're done, but so far so good.
Here's hoping it continues on that route. This film, which I read was shot in 2022, it's been a bit of a long life for it to come to theaters finally. I'm curious, how did you become involved with this project?
Well, it emerged during the pandemic, actually. It was an interesting project to come your way during that period of time when we're sort of all cut off from each other, which is a sort of one of the themes of Beckett's work in a way. So the script came to me and it had, a very conventional first few pages, which I thought, well, this is kind of predictable and I'm not sure this is going to be right for me. But then suddenly it takes a very interesting turn and goes into a very different kind of sort of experience. And so that was my first kind of engagement with it was during the pandemic. I'd read some Beckett when I was a student, but hadn't really been a Beckett sort of connoisseur. And it came to me sort of in later life in a way. And so when you go back to reading things that you didn't quite get when you were 18, you read them as a middle-aged man. I got a lot more out of Beckett's sort of sensibility, and I went back to the plays, and some of them you can see online. And again, the pandemic was a big part of this because you were sort of just cut off from everybody. And it felt like some of Beckett's characters were sort of in that condition by definition. And so it emerged out of that. It started off as a kind of TV drama. It wasn't supposed to be a feature. And it kind of grew. And I cast Gabriel Byrne, who was really the first and only choice I had. And I kind of felt that if Gabriel would do it, then I would do it. So I was sort of knowing that that piece of casting was the most significant choice I was going to make. And Gabriel was really the only person I thought of when I began to read it and think about Irish actors who would be right for this. So we then met online, as you do, and got on very well. And Gabriel had some interesting ideas about the script. He knew Beckett quite well. He is a man of the theatre generally. So that collaboration became the kind of foundation stone for the film with Gabriel. And as you know, if you've seen the film, or if you haven't seen it, I can tell you. There's two versions of Beckett in the film, both of which are played by Gabriel, and they have a kind of dialogue with each other in this rather sort of strange, sort of abstract place. And they review his life, really. And the kind of theme of the review is all the terrible mistakes he's made in his life. So you have a kind of biographical sort of story where he's sort of selecting the things that he's most ashamed of, which is an interesting premise for any kind of biopic.
Very different from what we usually get.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and I've done a few, as you know, and so this one was, so you go to these sort of episodes in his life, chronologically somewhat, with a kind of framing device, which I'm sure everyone's now confused by. But anyway, ask me another question so I can stop rambling on here.
Well, I know that when it comes to the plays, I have a background in theater. That the Beckett estate is sort of notoriously strict about how his plays are to be staged. So I'm curious if they had any involvement with this project at all. Did you
Well, I
work with
think
them?
none whatsoever for that
Ah,
reason. It's a kind of a playful account of Beckett. It's not, a serious literary evaluation of Beckett.
yeah.
That wouldn't A film really isn't the right place to do that. It's like with theoretical physics and Stephen Hawking and the theory of everything. It's really not the place. The film isn't the best place to argue about the abstractions of theoretical physics. So to answer your question, the Beckett estate weren't involved in this. We don't, and that kind of handicapped us in certain ways and put boundaries on what we could do. So we are able to quote from the plays in a kind of context of commenting on them. So there are some episodes from a play called Play, which I think most people who know Beckett know that's quite an autobiographical work. And it's about infidelity and about a man with two a mistress and a wife who kind of squabble in the course of this play. So we quote from that play, but sometimes, by not having the work to quote from, you can kind of allude to it in various ways, which we do. So I think for Beckett scholars, they may find this a little bit deficient in Beckett's work. But for those who don't know much about Beckett or know the cliches, if you like, that Beckett's kind of acquired over the years, we fully address those.
Yeah, it's interesting, it's not so much about his work, it's about his life and who he was as a person, which is for me, that's something that I knew much less about.
Well,
Um,
you and me both, and that was a good
yeah.
starting point. I knew a bit about Beckett. I knew that, he wasn't your traditional Irish writer. He had a slightly different background.
Yeah.
He's uh, Protestant in a largely Catholic country. He's kind of middle class. He's not, in the from the Dublin underclass. He's not Brendan Behan, so he's got a different kind of vibe to him than other Irish writers. And his life is incredibly interesting. It's surprising
Yeah.
for someone who writes in such a minimalist kind of way, and his sort of staging his plays are very minimalist, and yet his life is so rich with adventure and surprise. Not least, he was in the French Resistance. He was, in quite a lot of jeopardy in that role. Um, and he was stabbed sort of spontaneously by a pimp in Paris just before the war, which again, for no reason at all, which sort of suits Beckett's work quite well, I
Yeah.
think, that illogical episode.
Yes,
But his
very
life
much.
is rich and full of drama, and he has a very sort of tormented love life and marital life as well. So the film does review essentially his relationships, mostly with women, starting with his mother, who was a
Hmm.
sort of powerful and slightly misanthropic kind of figure. So we go through these episodes in his life, and I think for those that know some of Beckett's work, you can see clear connections with the
Yeah.
life and the work. I mean, there's an episode in the film when Beckett's in the Resistance where he's in a kind of ambush situation with
Hmm.
his resistance colleagues, and nothing happens. They wait and they wait and wait, and
It's
nothing
great.
happens. And it's a non-event, but it's a non-event that resonates in a certain kind of way. And that's interesting when you read Waiting for Godot. It's definitely a post-war work. It is written immediately after the war, and you kind of feel like this wartime experience feeds into that play in interesting ways. And I think the film points up some of those ideas or some of those connections. But
Yeah.
it's not a kind of literary evaluation of Beckett's work. It's a life
Mm.
story with reference to the work and with kind of clues as to how the work emerged from Beckett's life experience.
Yeah, and you have this space where Samuel Beckett and the other Beckett that you talked about sort of meet and talk, which has a very waiting for Godot feel to it, but instead of staging it and like by a crossroads, you have this sort of ancient
Yes, well,
tomb-like atmosphere. It
yeah,
feels like ruins of
yeah.
some sort almost. And I'm wondering, where you found this, how you decided what that place should look like.
That's a really interesting question because in the script it's just called a wasteland, which obviously
Mm,
does allude to
yeah.
some waiting for Godot. So you're kind of wondering what can this be, and so we shot the film in Budapest for reasons of the budget. We couldn't afford to shoot in Paris where most of the story unfolds. And Budapest is a sort of very sort of traditional European city, and it actually has quite a few areas that look much like Paris. So when I went there, I said, "Well, we need to kind of find this sort of place. Maybe I should just back up a second." So the film starts with what appears to be Beckett at the Nobel Prize ceremony, about to receive his Nobel Prize, which is itself not actually true. He didn't show up for that, but we put him there. And instead of going to get his prize, he clambers. I'm ruining the film for you a bit here. Anyway, he ends up
Just the
not getting
opening.
the prize. Yes, and he ends up in this rather weird sort of nondescript environment. When I went to Hungary, I said to the location researcher there, just find me any interesting places in Budapest or thereabouts that are just kind of odd or unusual or abandoned in some way. And this was an abandoned quarry which has a kind of interesting sort of mashup of real untouched stone and quarry sort of elements. So you don't quite know where it is. And when I saw this, I thought that's exactly right. It's sort of nowhere and somewhere. It's non-specific, but it feels sort of timeless. So that's where we ended up shooting it, and we shot it in a very sort of lo-fi way. We couldn't use the sort of the Marvel universe sort of special effects. We had to do ours in a very old-fashioned in-camera way, which was very hard for Gabriel as an actor to be sort of taking his costume off, putting another one on, and going back into the same space and shooting it in camera, with a divided sort of screen in camera, which I don't need to kind of bore you with the details of that. But so that's where Beckett and his alter ego sort of talk about his life and review it based on the principle of the things he's ashamed of. I think I've rambled off into some other digression here, but so put me back on the straight and narrow.
Well, no, the other thing that was most striking to me about the film is, of course, the decision to shoot most of it in black and white, except for the last chapter, which you shot in
Mm.
color. Where I'm wondering, where that decision came from.
Well, I mean, I think it started with Beckett himself and the imagery we have of Beckett, which is, you know, the image I had of Beckett before I started the project was these sort of withering black and white portraits of him. Um, and sort of Beckett, for me, seemed to live in a sort of black and white world. And one of the sort of major influences on the film was a photographer called Brassai, who was a Hungarian photographer, bizarrely, who worked in Paris. And they're all in black and white. And so I thought, well, this is a great inspiration for the world of Beckett, these shots of Paris in the 1930s and 1940s by Brassai, this Hungarian photographer. And they're all black and white. And the third and maybe the most sort of cynical reason is that when you're shooting period in a city that isn't the city you want it to be in, if you shoot in monochrome, you're eliminating, certain amounts of detail that allow you, I think, to sell the idea of the time period and indeed the location in a more minimalist way, and therefore it has a sort of integrity about it. And I think, what's interesting about the world of cinema is that in the last 20 years, black and white has become another sort of, it's come back as a sort of aesthetic resource for filmmakers. I think of Roma, for example, which was a really beautiful black and white film. And so it felt available, the black and white option. And when I started shooting tests on it, I really got excited by the fact that this was the way to shoot the film. So it was a kind of, there were three elements to it, and they all seemed to kind of point me in that direction. And the final episode in color is when you kind of enter into real time, a present tense with Beckett and his wife and his mistress in Paris in the 1980s. So it felt like a good way to kind of put the film in the sort of in the modern world, if you like, with Beckett himself in the modern world finally as well.
I like that a lot. It's a very fine line to walk in terms of the Beckett-like performance style, the very completely devoid of affect and generally going very fast through the text. And I think it's a very fine line to walk, and I think you managed a tone that has nods to that style a little bit. But I'm curious, how long did it take you to arrive on, the right tone and style for filming this that nods to Beckett without being it so in your face, which may be difficult for audiences.
Well, indeed. I mean, it was mostly in the original script. There's
Mm.
a tone there that's actually quite playful and not earnest and not kind of, sort of full of sort of aesthetic sincerity when it came to the work. So the tone it's a lighter film than you might expect from Beckett's work. And I think that sort of makes it a bit more, I mean, user friendly. Beckett himself, from people that knew him, wasn't a miserable person. He was kind of witty and sort of stable and not the person you might think. I mean, he obviously had lots of, it would seem, inner torment. But the playful tone, I think, was right for the film. And hopefully it's more witty than it is earnest.
Oh, absolutely. It has a very dry humor to it at a lot of points, I
Well,
think, which
also, I
felt
mean, it's worth,
very, yeah.
sorry to interrupt. It was I just trying to complete the thought in a way, which is
Mm,
just it's about the actors and how they wanted to play it as well,
yeah.
and each Aidan Gillen, who plays James Joyce, you know gave us a kind of very interesting version of that, which was sort of, again, it was quite playful and was really channeling the real Joyce and his habits and his sort of way of, and Joyce was quite eccentric. And so Aidan sort of captured that, I thought, very well. And that gives the film, again, a kind of much lighter tone, the characterization of James Joyce. And so, and likewise, Fionn O'Shea, who played the younger version of Beckett, adopted a more, he wasn't, he was quite a serious young man. Um, but again, he's not playing it in a very earnest sort of way, which is what was those were the choices they made and ones that I supported and encouraged.
Yeah, it comes across really well. Um, you know, there's a line in the film, the other Beckett says something to the effect of, there are men who need to believe in a better world, and then there's you, meaning Beckett, who needs to believe in a worse one.
Mm.
Which one are you?
Oh, I'm definitely the latter.
Ah, really?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yes, so I mean, I think that's a personality thing really more than anything else. I mean, you can be, pessimistic, in a sort of general sense, which I guess I am. Um, it's not that you want to believe in a world that's worse, it's because you have plenty of evidence to support that belief, basically. And that might be true of Beckett too. Not that I would flatter myself with the comparison, but the idea that if you if you look at the world around you, I mean, you can say it's a contemporary thing, but people have always felt this way. You can find lots of reasons to be despondent.
I certainly true. You were coming up on the end of our time together, but before we go, I wanted to ask, you've transitioned in your career at this point from shooting documentaries to narrative features rather seamlessly. And I'm wondering why you think we don't see more documentarians take on nonfiction projects every
Or
once in a
fiction
while,
project.
or fiction projects even with, but
Indeed.
a
Well,
narrative feature, let's say.
that's probably a question for those out there that could be doing it. And I mean, there has been some crossover, not as much as you'd expect, really. And I'm not quite sure why. I mean, for me, it was always the bigger ambition I had when I started out making films was to try and use the bigger train set, if you like, to be sort of vainglorious about it. And it is a different proposition. I find shooting features much more demanding. And there's quite a different skill set involved too. But some of the things you take from documentaries, like story structure, and indeed the engagement with interviewees is not that different from the engagement with actors, that you're trying to make them feel comfortable to give you their best. So I'm surprised this doesn't happen more often. Maybe it's quite difficult. I mean, um, I made my first feature film quite a long time ago now in 2004. Um, and maybe it's a bit more difficult to do that now, but it is surprising that there's not a bigger overlap between the two. And I can't think, I mean, Werner Herzog is the obvious example of someone who has worked, but mostly worked in documentaries in later life. Um, and there are others too, I'm sure you can think of who
Yeah.
transitioned. But I love documentaries, but I want to find one that sort of is, you know, equal to 2 years of your life, basically, which is
Right.
what they tend to be. Whereas a drama or TV drama tends to be a bit self-contained. But it's an interesting question.
And an interesting actor and a very interesting conversation. That's all the time we have. So thank you so much for speaking with us,
Indeed, well,
Mr.
thank you
Marsh.
for, no, indeed, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.